I'm Daniel Shin, and welcome to the discussion on Christianity and Law with the Dean. Dean Enlow, it seems that we've come to a conclusion of the first section of this semester's lectures. And it seems that Paul's argument has kind of snowballed, and your position on it has also kind of become a snowball of everything that Paul's doing. So could you give us a summary of where Paul's going to from this point on?
So today we treated Paul's argument about the right of apostles to support in food and drink in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And it sets up very nicely, it illustrates everything we've been covering thus far. Paul argues like contemporary lawyers. So for example, today he's treating a particular stipulation of the law, a particular statute in the law from Deuteronomy 25:4, do not muzzle the ox, and he is drawing out with legal interpretation all of the consequences of that law, and he engages in a very intricate legal argument requiring him to look at the purposes of the law. So that's one basic thing that we've seen in this course. I think it's very important. Paul is engaged in the same kind of legal arguments that we are. Secondly, when he approaches those legal arguments, he is not engaged in, as some modern thinkers would like it to be, a kind of quasi-scientific, mathematical, or deductive operation. He is boldly being persuasive. He is employing many tactics of persuasion that we lawyers today also do, but sometimes people question whether we should do that. Is the project of being persuasive, is it appropriate to somebody who's concerned with the truth? And I think it's very important that Paul does this because it tells us, yes, it is. Mm-hmm. That when you are driven to help someone see the truth, it is perfectly appropriate to rely on appeals to one's own character, to move the people with passionate examples, and also, as Paul does, to argue in a logical, deductive manner. All of those things go into the proper package of persuasion. Finally, a really important example, issue in today's argument, and this is going to move us forward in the course, is when we were reading Galatians, of course, Paul is, in some sense, denigrating the law. I mean, really, he's saying that the gospel is the completion of the law, but he says, look, the law is like slavery. The law is like a slave. Those who are under the law are like people under slavery. And so some Christians think, well, then the law has nothing to do with the life of a Christian. But today is a really important example where Paul is very forthrightly saying what we should do in the church today as Christians, we can learn by looking at the standards of justice and right taught in the law. Although he thinks that we shouldn't be under the law, we shouldn't obey it for the purposes of salvation, he certainly continues to treat it as a guide to Christians. And this is a really important point. And that's going to tie into what we're going to do next week, is we're going to be starting to look at the way Paul argues about human laws in general. What is the role of human law? He's arguing about law itself. And so we'll be treating that for the next 3 weeks after that. And that's the tie-in. Today he shows us the law is still important. The law still has meaning for us. It still guides us even though we're free in Christ. It still is a guide for us. And so that's going to tie in and lead us forward to the next section of the course.
A point that really stood out for me today was where you mentioned that Paul had an easier way, something that I think modern lawyers would consider to be a better form of argument, which is where just say, Jesus said this, so therefore I have a right. He doesn't do that. Could you give us a short introduction of that part of the lecture?
I mean, it's really fascinating. So the issue that he's raised in this section in chapter 9 is, do apostles have a right to food and drink? And all the way down in verse 14, after many, many, many other arguments, he finally lets drop, hey, by the way, Jesus taught this in Luke, that evangelists have a right to food and drink from the people they're evangelizing. And you scratch your head and say, well, Paul, why didn't you just start there? Instead, the first statute he cites, so to speak, is the rule that you shouldn't muzzle an ox when it's threshing out the grain. And so this is doing several things, I think, as I talked about in the lecture. One, that passage is actually the deepest reason that can be given for reasons that I try to explain in the lecture. But also it's part of a rhetorical movement where, because he knows his audience is resistant, he doesn't want to just set up a direct clash with his audience and go, hey, Jesus said it, we're done. He's moving them not only to obey the Lord, but as free people, to do it because they understand, because they love, because they understand the meaning of what they're doing, so they can do it in Christian love as opposed to in legalistic obedience. And I hope I brought out in the lecture the real drama of this argument with its many stages, its rhetorical questions that it opens with, its arguments to common sense, its first move with the statute of the ox, and then a slightly closer comparison with the priests in the temple, until finally he gets to Christ's authority. Certainly, many times as lawyers, we're going to begin with the first statute, but this is a case where Paul is essentially saying, before I get into how we interpret Christ's command, I'm going to lay out the full framework of policy, the full framework of rights that are involved here before I hit you with the most relevant passage. It's a dramatically constructed argument. It's very powerful. And when you think about this problem, why does he begin with the ox? It really clues you into just how rhetorical Paul is being in this passage.
Well, today's lecture was very eye-opening, so I enjoyed it very much. And so if anyone else wants to know more about the lecture, please follow us on YouTube and listen in on the lecture given by Dean Enlow today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.